Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund.
They realized that a democracy required a totally new kind of approach to the society and to education. The people would have to rule, and therefore they had to be educated.
How America's founders took pains to promote a free press and good schools. You're listening to a Humankind Special, An Informed Republic. I'm David Freudberg. Right from the start of their high-risk 18th century experiment in democracy, the founders of America recognized an essential truth. For their system of self-government to survive, and many doubted whether it would, we the people need to stay informed, said James Madison, who became known as Father of the Constitution. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Journalism historian Robert McChesney.
If people don't know what's going on, they can't really participate at all. And governance will become increasingly run by private special interest, by corporate interest, by those who have the money and wherewithal to know what's going on, to buy politicians, to become the politicians themselves in many cases. Is increasingly we're seeing in politics where just billionaires and multimillionaires just run for office and on their own. It will lead to increasing cynicism, inequality, corruption, all the things that are cancerous to self-government.
So the American revolutionaries saw that independent journalism would be needed to monitor the functioning of government and the forces that influence it.
This isn't some sort of crazy academic theory. This is directly out of Jefferson and Madison. They understood that from the beginning. And that's why both of them said having a viable, credible press system is simply indispensable. It's the first order of business for a free society.
I'm in Washington on a sunny afternoon outside the Newseum, a magnificent gallery and interactive exhibit about America's centuries-old tradition of journalism. The facade of this sixth-floor building displays a large marble tablet. Engraved in it is the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government.
In one hall of the Newseum, early newspapers are exhibited, one from England the size of a pamphlet dating back to the 1400s. Olivia Blanchard stood gazing into the glass display case.
I think it's amazing that so long ago, people were writing news and looking for the truth.
It's also amazing that they were able to preserve these old papers, that they didn't just crumble over time.
It's the coolest thing to be able to see what people saw back then. It's amazing how detailed the illustrations were.
How important do you think it is for our country to have the ability to express ourselves and for journalism to be able to operate freely?
I think it's so important because without the freedom to know the truth, to tell people what's going on, we don't really know what's happening, and to not know what's happening, bad things can happen again, and that's never good.
There's many other parts of the world that don't have a free press, or ones that are obviously controlled by the government, and they are much different, much closed societies that don't have anywhere near the freedom of information that we have to make important decisions.
Now, that said, do you think the average American is getting adequate information to perform our duties as citizens?
I think that never before have we had so many different news outlets and channels to choose from, and I think it's up to everybody to not focus in on one single voice, but to do a medley of all of the points of view, because no one of them is correct. Every media has its own specific bias.
I think that some newspapers, and I won't call names, I think they tend to write from a certain angle. And during election time, for me, it's apparent that some papers are supporting certain candidates. So they tend to write in favor of one candidate and against another.
They had to have an educated citizenry or the whole venture, and they saw it as an adventure, as a challenge, would fail. The experiment would fail.
Brown University historian Gordon Wood is author of Empire of Liberty and winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He's an expert on the early American Republic.
Nothing on this scale, Democratic government or Republican government, had ever been tried since the fall of Rome. So they know they're doing something very new, very tricky, very problematic. Can we make it succeed? That's what, of course, runs right through American history. That's what Lincoln is talking about 70 years later. We have the last best hope. Can we make it? Can democracy make it? That's an issue that they think about, and they have confidence, but they need an educated citizenry.
In the 1770s, the decade of ferment that gave birth to the United States, American colonists became agitated by what they saw as unfair tax policies and trade restrictions, as well as harassment by the British Crown. As the revolutionaries' movement gained momentum, activists in the 13 East Coast colonies strengthened their lines of communication.
Up and down the seaboard, there was an effort through newspapers and pamphlets to engage the citizenry, to inform them about their political rights, and they believed that if the population was well informed about their political rights, then British measures at tyranny would be stymied.
Richard Brown, University of Connecticut historian and author of The Strength of a People.
Their ideology that came out of opposition politics in Britain told them that if a people was ignorant, sleepy, lazy, they were easily manipulated by demagogues and tyrants.
But cultivation of an informed citizenry was viewed by the revolutionaries as more than a political necessity. When America's founders sounded the Liberty Bell at Philadelphia to let freedom ring, they were proclaiming a new view of human rights, even if that view was constrained by 18th century mores. For Virginia's Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, it was the starting point for an entirely different kind of society.
Well, the vision would be that when human beings are educated, that they live their lives by reason. He was a person who believed that reason should be, as he said, in its seat, and progress would unfold from there.
Historian and law professor Annette Gordon-Reed, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award for her book The Hemmingses of Monticello, is a Jefferson scholar.
So this idea of the diffusion of knowledge throughout the citizenry was a way of ensuring that the values of the Enlightenment, of which he would have thought of himself as an Enlightenment progressive type, would spread across the country and would spread across the land. And he almost saw it as an inevitable thing, that if educated people would make the right choices. Now, that was a part of his own sort of personal optimism. And, of course, there were people who felt differently, who had a more, they would say, realistic view of human nature, saying that that's not going to be enough, that, in fact, you have to have an elite or elites in order to make decisions, that they will be the people who will always rule. That was much more of a Hamiltonian vision, that there would always be an elite who would control. I think Jefferson and others took a more capacious view of what democracy should be, that in fact the more people who were involved, more people who were educated, more people who were knowledgeable, that it would fuel the general sense of progress in the world. And you wouldn't have to rely upon elites to do that. But I think all of them understood there had to be citizen involvement. With no monarchy, the people had to be sovereign.
Once the final state, Rhode Island, ratified the Constitution, America's founders realized that newspapers, often transported by horseback riders, would play a vital role in preservation of the emerging country. Richard Brown.
They understand that they have a vast territory in 1790, that in order to create a nation, there must be a community of citizenship, a community of information. And if there is to be such a community of information, there must be national networks that will enable this community of information to be created and to continue to operate. And the idea was that the newspapers should be a mechanism whereby people should be informed about public affairs, local affairs, state affairs, national affairs, international affairs. They wanted people to not be parochial, located only in their own little community, but to raise their consciousness to a broader appreciation of public affairs.
Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. Thomas Jefferson.
The founders of the United States were keenly aware that democracy always comes with risks. For the system to work, for voters to make wise choices, the citizenry must make the effort to be knowledgeable. Said American revolutionary Thomas Paine, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigue of supporting it.
People can be fooled if you don't know how the government works, if you don't know your own powers as a citizen, what you have a right to demand, what you have a right to expect from your leaders.
Historian and New York Law School professor Annette Gordon-Reed.
You have to know how it works. And it's not a terribly complicated process. Strangely enough, it's not a wildly, convoluted system we have here. But I think the real thing is that you can't make the government work for you. You can't play your role in the government if you don't understand how these things work. And it's really frightening to think that people don't understand, the rights, the Bill of Rights, don't understand the Constitution, don't understand the procedures that make the government run. And it's all about, that's how you preserve freedom. You have to be knowledgeable in order to do that.
If you think of authoritarian governments, they hold the society together from the top down. But a republic or a democracy has to be held together from the bottom up. And so you need people who are educated, who are willing to support the society, are willing to give up their selfish interests for the sake of the public good, and these people need to be educated.
Jefferson's commitment to education was really at the core of his life.
Charles Haynes, senior scholar at the First Amendment Center in Washington, has studied the American revolutionaries.
They were part of this influence of the Enlightenment that said, learning and education really can lead to progress, lead to truth. And they had a deep commitment to that.